It is time for us to start digging into our social studies unit as we start to talk about Native Americans. And it's important for us to be able to compare the lives of American Indians to our own lives in order to understand the major differences and the major similarities that there are in those two different cultures. One of the culminating events of this unit is going to be us researching artifacts, things that Native Americans used in their lives, tools and weapons, the way they built their buildings. And we're going to create those artifacts in the classroom. And we're going to be able to write a very, very small paper comparing that to our lives now. How are these things similar? How are these things completely different? Some of these things, are they even still used today? And that will be the major grade that you get for this unit. We will do all of that in class. You don't have to do any of that at home, so that'll be something very easy for us to take care of. So who are these Native Americans or American Indians that we hear so much about? The first thing we need to understand is they are the indigenous peoples of the United States. What are indigenous peoples, Mr. Bullens? The first people to live in a land are called indigenous peoples. I think that's something very, very important that we should probably hear those types of words. It'd be a good quiz question if we had one of those. Indigenous peoples, the first people to live in the land, the original settlers. The Native Americans are the indigenous peoples of the United States. They were here before the Vikings and Leif Erikson. They were here before Christopher Columbus. They were here before any of the explorers started showing up. They were here before the colonists started moving in and started settling all of the land, pushing the Native Americans further and further out west. They were here before all of that because they are the indigenous peoples. Sometimes you might hear Native Americans referred to as Indians. You might hear them referred to as American Indians. And there's a big reason behind this. Why? Well, when Columbus landed here in America the first time around, he thought he had sailed to India. So he called them Indians. And the name stuck around for a while. The Native American social structure. What is social structure, Mr. Bullens? Well, we have social structure. We have a government in place. We have laws in place. We have larger governments. We have smaller governments under that. We have people that are in authority. And the social structure for the Native Americans was very different. They had no written rules and laws, no confusing governments, but they did have social rules that people were expected to abide by. Don't come to my tent and steal all the fish that I just worked so hard for the day before, because I'm probably going to share them with everyone anyway. Don't start cutting down all the trees near my land. There's plenty of forest. We can cut down trees in places. As a matter of fact, I'll probably even help you if you ask, because it's going to be for the betterment of the tribe. So it was, if you wanted to live in the tribe, you had to follow these unwritten rules. And we kind of know some of those things, like the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. That's not necessarily something that's written down. That's just something that everyone kind of expects. Common courtesy and being kind. Don't walk over to your neighbor's house and just kill them, because those are societal rules that I think everyone kind of understands. And the Native Americans had those types of rules in place. They just didn't have a set system of government that was in place. What the Native Americans did have, however, were tribes and clans. At the highest level, as you can see up here at the top, at the highest level were the tribes, the nations, the large groups of different types of Native Americans. And each group had their own subculture, the way that they did things. They had a certain place that they lived. For instance, the Cherokee that lived in North Carolina. They had a very specific culture. They had things that they did. They had a place that they lived. And then a very specific language. So you might have the Iroquois and the Cherokee, who spoke different languages, had a very similar cultures, but some differences, but they lived in different places. And I think it's very, very important to understand that. In each tribe, so we'll take the Cherokee tribe, you have these smaller groups called clans. And the clans were mostly related to each other. So it's like very, very large groups of family. The clans had their own symbol or their own spirit that gave the clan their name. Lots of the clan names were named after animals. The Bear Clan, the Hawk Clan, the Snow Clan, those types of things. I think I would like to be part of the Mountain Clan. That might be why I like the Cherokee so much. They live in the mountains, and I love being in the mountains. So again, at the highest level, you had your tribe. Underneath that, you had the clans, and the clans were smaller groups of people that were kind of related to each other. So not necessarily, it wasn't a giant form of government. The tribes weren't a specific government by any like Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't like that. They were just large groups of Native Americans that were very similar. When we got down to the clan level, the leaders of the clans were called chiefs. Now, this is probably one of the words that you might be familiar with. You've probably even seen a picture very similar to the background, and you may have actually heard of an Indian chief. They were chosen by the clan, so I guess that is similar to the way that we choose our elected officials in the United States. They did not have complete power. They couldn't tell everyone everything to do. That's very similar to our government as well. But they were very respected, and they provided advice, and they did tell the clan what they would like to see happen, and it probably happened most of the time, but they didn't have complete power. Clans had a civil leader and a war leader. The civil leader kind of guided them around during times of peace when things were going well, helped guide them in planting and growing their clans and moving to different places. And then there was the war leader who took over if there ever happened to be a clash with other people. And I think that, again, is somewhat similar. I don't think somebody new takes over when there's war, but I know that there are people in the military that have more say when there's war going on, and there are people that are more into the civil type of things when the country is not in war, that have more of a say of what's going on. So it's very different, but it's kind of similar in a lot of different ways. So I want to go back just really quickly just to talk about this. You have tribes. Underneath that, you have these groups, and when I say smaller, it's still a fairly large group of people called clans. And now let's look at this. Clans were divided up into villages and families. This is the group that played probably a more important role in the daily lives. These are the people you saw every day. These are the people that you lived with. These are the people that you worked with. These are the people that you went to school with. These are the people who you took care of their kids and they took care of your kids. These are the people you fished with, you hunted with. These are the people you lived with on a day-to-day basis. It would be kind of like your family and all your grandmas and grandpas and cousins all in one area. And there are some people that still kind of live in these small, like, villages, like their whole family lives like in pretty much the same area. Or maybe even the same neighborhood. I've seen that a few times. Not very often, though. Not quite like this. These are the people that you would deal with on a daily basis. This would be your villages and your families. When we look at the men and women of the Native Americans, they had different jobs and things that they did on a day-to-day basis, and they had different jobs in leadership. If we think back to a few slides ago, we had the chiefs. They were typically the men. However, that didn't mean that the women were powerless. Their opinion was just as respected. And the women were the leaders inside of the home. Men were responsible for the hunting. They were responsible for war. If people came in from the outside, the men dealt with outsiders. But the women managed the community, the things that happen on a day-to-day basis inside that village that we talked about. Let's get a little bit more specific than just that. Let's look a little bit more at what the women did. The women were in charge of the home and they were in charge of the fields. And you got to imagine that's a huge job because they worked extremely hard in these fields, and these fields provided food at times that maybe other animals weren't around or the fishing wasn't great. The fields were extremely important. Not only did they work in the fields, but they cooked and prepared the meals. That could be skinning and cleaning out any deer or fish that had been caught. You could be out gathering fruit and nuts. You could be building fires. You could be putting different meats in the smokehouse so that the meat can be stored for the winter. You're talking a really long, hard day's work. In many of the tribes, the women were responsible for harvesting the crops. Not only did they plant and sow the fields, they harvested the crops. And I know we have some kids that work on farms in our 5th grade class. You can ask them. That's not an easy job, and we're doing it with machines, not with our hands. The women also raised the children. Just take a few minutes and ask your mom if she thinks that she could tend the fields, skin things, keep cooking, build fires, smoke meat, all while taking care of a baby. She's going to tell you yes, because moms are daggum awesome, but it wouldn't be very easy. When a tribe moved, it was the woman's job to pack up everything for moving and set it back up when they got to the new place. And so the women often owned the home and everything that was in it, which is pretty awesome. The women were extremely well respected for their hard work and for providing food from all of the farming. Now you might be thinking, Mr. B, like they pretty much run the show. Yeah, pretty much. What'd the men do? Let's find out. The men were in charge of the tribe's activities outside of the home, dealing with outsiders. Their main job was to hunt and fish and build. And as we've talked about in science, animals weren't just used for food. Their skins and their fur was made for clothing. And sometimes the skins were made to cover the outside of the homes. The men were responsible for any time there was war, and they were responsible for protecting the village as well. They built the weapons. They built the boats that they used for traveling and for fishing. In most tribes, the men were the political and the religious leaders. They would build the homes, and they would help plant some of the crops. Men and women did have very different roles. And this might shock you, this part right here, but generally had equal rights. It's going to be a little while before we get into women's rights, but we'll study that later on. It took a while in the United States before men and women had equal rights. In some tribes, the chief was a man. I like this, but he was elected by the women. I like how both the men and women have such a huge part, and it's this like bouncing back and forth. I'll do this and you do this. You help me with this and I'll help you with this. It was a partnership that they had, and that's when things worked the best. Well, Mr. B, you might say, that's all fascinating that women did this and men did that, but that has no bearing in my life because I'm a kid. Kids. Young children and babies spent all of their time close to their mom. The mom would go about doing all of her work. Think about all that work that she did. She carried the baby on her back in this thing called a cradle board. Now, I've had a backpack that I carried my kids around when I went hiking, but I certainly didn't bring them to work. The mother would nurse the child until it was like 2 or 3 years old. So here's a little bit clearer picture of that. You can see this, how you would keep the baby in this backpack and tie it up pretty tight. Looks like tying a shoe. I have no clue how that works. Somebody build one of those as an artifact. That would be awesome. Did the kids go to school? I mean, we're in school looking at this. You obviously have to ask that question. The early tribes did not have official schools, but the children were expected to learn. The boys would follow the men around and learn how to hunt and fish and build. The young girls followed the women around and learned to do the traditional women's work, like making baskets, working in the fields, cooking, building fires, and taking care of siblings. The children did learn the history and the moral rules of the tribe through stories that were told, these oral stories that were told and passed down from generation to generation. So they learned it by listening to their grandparents and great-grandparents tell these stories about the way the tribes worked and the way the tribes should work. That wraps up this lesson on Native Americans, and we will pick back up next week as we build our artifacts.